Unleashing immediate central influence, this opening thrust seeks to dictate early play and unlock diagonal lines for bishops. Challenging white's central dominance, this opening immediately sets up a sharp, unbalanced struggle. Instantly eyeing central influence and preparing rapid development, this knight boldly stakes its claim. Developing the knight to a natural square, this solidifies central influence and prepares for pawn advances, embracing the Sicilian's dynamic character. Cracking open the center immediately invites a dynamic central struggle, aiming to seize initiative. Opening the center this way initiates a sharp, tactical battle, forcing quick calculation. Capturing the pawn opens lines and initiates piece development, challenging black's central presence. Embracing the Sicilian dragon setup, black immediately challenges white's central control while preparing to fianchetto the bishop. Developing another knight solidifies control over the central squares, preparing for a potential kingside assault and limiting black's maneuvering options. Developing the bishop to this square now reinforces control over key central diagonals, preparing for active piece play. A solidifying pawn formation now supports development, aiming to contest the center and prepare for kingside castle. Black's knight now actively contests the central squares, preventing white's pawns from expanding further and preparing for potential kingside expansion or even a timely e5 break. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure and preparing to castle, this maneuver prioritizes safety and sets the stage for future queenside expansion, subtly shifting the game's focus away from immediate central confrontation towards a more positional struggle. Securing the king's safety through castling here is a prudent step, immediately withdrawing it from the center's potential storm and preparing for its eventual redeployment to a more active post. Unleashing a pawn storm towards the queenside, white aggressively stakes a claim for space and initiates a direct assault on black's kingside fortifications, aiming to exploit the fianchettoed bishop's less active diagonal and potentially expose the castled monarch. Solidifying the center and preparing for a potential pawn advance with e5, this move also aims to connect the rooks and improve their coordination along the now open d-file, while simultaneously reinforcing the king's safety. Relocating the knight to b3 immediately sets a subtle trap, eyeing the queenside squares while also preparing for a potential advance of the queenside pawns. This repositioning avoids the immediate pressure of the knight on d4 and offers a more flexible defense of the central pawn structure, potentially supporting a later c4 push to gain more space. Developing the bishop to e6, black prepares to challenge the knight on b3 and solidify the center. This bishop now eyes the kingside, potentially participating in future attacks, while also freeing the c8 square for the queen should the need arise. It's a flexible piece placement that subtly improves black's coordination. Initiating a kingside pawn storm to seize initiative, this aggressive push aims to dislodge black's defenders and expose the monarch, though it does create some potential weaknesses. Black boldly challenges white's central grip and spatial advantage, opening lines and seeking counterplay. Unleashing a pawn storm, white initiates a direct confrontation in the center, aiming to shatter black's pawn shield and expose the castled king. This aggressive thrust, while potentially creating weaknesses, forces black to react immediately and dictates the rhythm of the ensuing battle, creating a tense dynamic where both sides must navigate the ensuing complications carefully. Strategically, black is offering a fascinating positional gambit, daring white to embrace a complex middle game where queenside pressure might outweigh kingside space. A pivotal moment arrives as white captures a central pawn, initiating a cascade of potential exchanges that could reshape the entire board's dynamic. This decision injects immediate tactical complexity, forcing black to confront the consequences of their recent pawn push and reassess the delicate balance of pieces in the core. The resulting open file for white's rook becomes an immediate strategic consideration, while black's bishop, temporarily displaced, must find a new avenue for influence. Boldly redirecting the knight, this move injects a sudden tactical complication, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and seize control of the crucial c2 square. It's a daring gambit that forces white to immediately confront the threat and decide whether to defend passively or engage in a sharp exchange that could open lines for black's queen. Unlocking the c-file for potential pawn pushes or even a queen infiltration becomes a primary objective, leveraging the bishop's redeployment to a square that simultaneously defends the knight and eyes the queen side. Black's capture on f5 fundamentally alters the pawn structure, opening the g-file for potential white counterplay while creating a passed pawn on d5 for black. The sacrifice of the pawn on f5 isn't just about material. It's about disrupting white's central pawn mass and creating dynamic imbalances. Sacrificing the pawn to open the g-file forces white to confront immediate attacking possibilities or concede significant queenside initiative. Opening the g-file with gxf5 is a bold decision, aiming to unravel white's kingside pawn structure in exchange for material. This capture, while seemingly simple, introduces significant complexity, demanding careful calculation from both sides regarding the newly exposed g-file. Sacrificing a pawn, white aims to disrupt black's queenside development and exploit the open file for potential future pressure. Clearing the central files now with the pawn thrust exposes the queen's knight's path, creating an immediate tactical opportunity. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure and preparing to open the g-file for future attack. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside often leads to dynamic play, and black's knight retreat to a6 here signals a strategic shift, perhaps aiming to reinforce the queenside or reposition for a counterthrust. The immediate consequence of black's capture is the opening of the g-file for white, potentially creating attacking lines. Yet black's knight on a6 is somewhat out of play for now, creating a slight imbalance in piece activity. White's pawn structure remains solid, with pieces poised for further development. This creates a fascinating tension where black must find a way to activate their pieces and potentially exploit white's slightly extended pawn front before white can fully capitalize on the open lines. Suddenly, a queenside assault seems to be brewing as white's queen elegantly sidesteps potential threats and prepares to join the fray, hinting at a potent pawn storm or a forceful battery formation. Unlocking the center with this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially open lines towards their king, but it simultaneously weakens the d6 square and creates potential targets for white's attacking pieces. Unleashing the kingside attack, white launches a bold castling maneuver, signaling intent to join the fray on the open files while simultaneously shielding their monarch behind a protective pawn wall. A strategic gamble that promises sharp exchanges and demands precise calculation from both sides. Opening up the d-file with the knight's sacrifice, black aims to disrupt white's king's safety and create counterplay. A bold gambit in a dynamic Sicilian position where material imbalance often dictates the narrative. Opening the h-file with this pawn thrust aims to create immediate attacking chances against black's castled king, exploiting the weakened dark squares and the absence of white's f-pawn. This pawn push creates an immediate tension, forcing white to confront a potential breakdown of their king's defenses, even as it appears to surrender central control. The strategic implication is that black is willing to accept a slightly less robust pawn structure in exchange for a direct attack on white's monarch. Embracing the open files, the rook galvanizes the central assault, seeking to exploit the vulnerable king's position while simultaneously shoring up the queenside's defensive structure. The queen now eyes the queenside, potentially bolstering the pawn chain or preparing for a future expansion. Meanwhile, the kingside looks increasingly perilous for black due to white's unleashed g-pawn and the compromised pawn structure around the black monarch. Liberating the c1 bishop from its passive post, this recapture instantly alters the central pawn structure, opening a pathway for piece activity and demanding black's immediate attention regarding piece coordination. Accepting the pawn sacrifice opens up lines towards black's monarch, transforming the pawn structure into a volatile, double-edged sword. Black must now prove the compensation is adequate by actively harassing white's advanced pawns and finding play in the center. Initiating a daring central exchange, this knight's sacrifice aims to destabilize black's pawn structure and open crucial lines for white's remaining pieces, potentially leading to a dangerous initiative. Shifting the king to the corner might seem like a retreat, but it strategically relocates the monarch away from the open g-file and the central pawn storm, creating a safer haven while eyeing potential counterplay with the knight and rook on the queen side. Sensing a shift in the game's equilibrium, white boldly intervenes with the bishop, aiming to disrupt black's rook's newfound access to the d-file and potentially exploit the exposed king. The bishop's placement on f4 isn't merely a defensive repositioning. It's a proactive measure, creating attacking avenues and limiting black's immediate counterplay by threatening to contest crucial squares. Opening up the g-file with your queen hints at a bold, perhaps even reckless, attempt to disrupt white's king's safety, but it risks leaving your monarch exposed to the newly activated bishop on f4 and the knight on c3. Re-establishing central pressure, the queen retreats to a more secure and flexible post, coordinating with the knight on b3 and preparing to potentially exploit the weakened kingside structure. Black unleashes a daring pawn sacrifice, aiming to shatter white's central pawn structure and expose the king. The bishop's sortie creates immediate tactical complications, forcing white to confront the threat of mate or significant material concession. This gambit hinges on black's ability to rapidly mobilize their remaining pieces and exploit the open lines that will inevitably result. Unleashing a furious counterattack, white decisively recaptures the bishop, aiming to dismantle black's central pawn chain and exploit the exposed kingside. This aggressive sequence, initiated by white's pawn push and the subsequent sacrifices, forces black to confront immediate tactical threats. The objective is to create chaos and leverage the open lines that have emerged. Unleashing a bishop directly into the enemy's newly opened king's flank introduces a whirlwind of tactical complications, threatening immediate checkmate possibilities and forcing white into a reactive defensive posture. Unleashing a ferocious assault along the open file, this aggressive maneuver aims to shatter black's defensive structure by directly targeting the beleaguered king, creating immediate tactical threats that demand precise calculation. Re-establishing the rook on the e-file, black aims to activate this typically sluggish piece and create more pressure along the open file, potentially contesting white's centralized queen and menacing the king. Reclaiming central space with the knight, this move immediately challenges black's rather precarious bishop on g4 and aims to dismantle the pressure on the kingside, potentially setting up a swift redeployment to a more active square like f5 or d5, depending on how black responds to the imminent threat of being outmaneuvered. Shifting the queen to this outpost on e4, while seemingly active, surrenders crucial central control and opens up a diagonal for white's bishop, potentially creating future complications for your king's safety. A precarious king situation for black is the immediate focus as white marshals forces for a decisive attack, aiming to exploit the exposed monarch and the weakened kingside pawn structure. The bishop retreats, seeking a safer square as the immediate kingside attack falters, but this redeployment arguably surrenders valuable central influence and may leave white's queen with more freedom to orchestrate a counterthrust. Unleashing a direct assault, white sacrifices the rook to shatter black's pawn shield and expose the king, opening a critical diagonal towards the monarch's sanctuary. This aggressive gambit seeks to capitalize on the compromised kingside structure, aiming to exploit the weakened squares and create immediate tactical threats. The force sequence promises a sharp, dynamic continuation where every tempo counts. The king, exposed and vulnerable on g7, now faces a significantly diminished defense, creating an immediate tactical opportunity for white to exploit the open g-file and the pinned pieces. Unleashing a desperate, yet potent, knight sacrifice to shatter the enemy's defenses and expose the beleaguered monarch. King's safety has completely dissolved. The monarch is now a pawn-capturing target on an open file, begging for a quick checkmate. Unleashing the rook along the newly opened file directly confronts the beleaguered black king, threatening immediate disruption and forcing a critical defensive decision. The black queen retreats to a seemingly safe square, but the underlying structure is becoming increasingly precarious. This maneuver, while avoiding immediate material loss, surrenders critical central space and further constrains the already passive pieces. Consider the long-term implications of this positional concession. The dark squares around the king are becoming a sieve, and the absence of active defenders will surely be exploited. Exposing the black king to a decisive battery of pieces, this capture clears the path for a swift conclusion. The pawn recaptures, but in doing so, it opens up the g-file for the rook, creating a direct assault line towards the now exposed black king. Unlocking the d-file, this maneuver dramatically shifts the focus towards centralizing the knight and potentially creating a powerful outpost, while simultaneously posing immediate threats to black's weakened pawn structure. A bold attempt to reclaim central influence and activate the rook, though the king's exposure remains a primary concern, leaving the queen side potentially vulnerable to further white incursions. Unleashing the bishop onto the long diagonal, white aims to exploit the weakened dark squares surrounding black's displaced king, creating immediate tactical threats and potentially opening lines for further attack. Consolidating the rook's activity to the central file is a sound defensive posture, aiming to shore up weaknesses around the newly castled monarch and prepare for potential counterplay. Striking the pinned knight immediately simplifies the position towards a favorable endgame for white, leveraging the open lines created by the past exchanges and aiming to exploit black's potentially weak pawn structure. Re-establishing central presence, this capture aims to disrupt white's knight outpost and open lines for counterplay against the exposed king. A surprising repositioning, NG, seeks to exploit the now open g-file, potentially targeting black's exposed king indirectly, or perhaps preparing a swift redeployment of the knight to a more active square like f6 or e5, aiming to disrupt black's currently rather static pawn structure and create threats. Reasserting pressure on the now open f-file, this move seeks to awaken the dormant rook and create immediate threats against white's king, which is still quite exposed despite its recent repositioning. The bolding of the rook implies a willingness to engage in tactical skirmishes and disrupt white's attempts to solidify their position, perhaps even hinting at a desperate but energetic counterplay on that critical vertical. A sudden shift in focus, the queen now eyes the vulnerable kingside, subtly threatening a smothered mate down the g-file should black misstep in this precarious pawn-down endgame. A desperate attempt to reignite some hope by forcing a check and creating a slight deflection, hoping to disrupt white's seemingly secure position before the inevitable endgame. King activation is the priority now, seeking safety and better squares as the material disparity becomes starkly apparent. Unleashing a desperate pawn push, the black king finds himself further exposed as the opponent's pieces swarm. Sensing an immediate mating net, white decisively intercepts the critical promotion square, forcing the black king into a precarious corner with no escape routes.